why it's better. Why is this this new covenant better?
It's final.
Yes,
Once for all.
that's right. You don't have to change it, renew it, whatever. That's right.
Eternal.
Yes, because, well, we have an eternal covenant because we have an eternal priest. Right. What else? What else makes the new covenant better?
The gospel releases God's people from the condemnation and punishment they deserve for their disobedience and brings about peace in their minds and hearts.
That's right. Yeah.
That's pretty good.
That quote from Jeremiah that we looked at last week was really important. All that cleansing that happened in Leviticus, how far did that penetrate into people?
It was all
That's right, it's all skin deep. And it's not like God didn't know that was the case, of course he did. All of that, the sprinkling with blood, the washing with water, all those things were external. But they're pointing ahead to something that's internal. And so in the prophecy of Jeremiah, he even said, a day is coming when the covenant's it's not going to be external, it's going to be internal. Because then the law is going to be written on your heart and on your mind. It's going to transform you from the inside out. God has always known that's what was necessary for people to be in right relationship with him. Was the blood of bulls and goats was never going to get it. And God knew that it was never going to. But all that was a physical illustration pointing ahead to the final sacrifice. So, go ahead.
Covenant. Because the old covenant.
That's right. And I think we talked about that last week, but let's just think again about the context for the readers. What's going on with these readers that the author's making this argument?
They're wanting to return to the new covenant, to the old covenant.
That's right. And if they go back to making the sacrifices that are lined out in Leviticus, what's the problem with that? That means Jesus isn't sufficient. It means you can somehow add another sacrifice onto the sacrifice of Christ, which he did. So it's important when you think back on the law of the Old Testament, some of the laws are reflections of God's character, and in principle, they are always relevant to us. So you think about, the Ten Commandments, you think about no lying, no stealing, those kinds of things. Because those reflect God's character, those are always relevant to God's people. And those are things, commands that we should be mindful of all the time. But the commands that deal with the ceremonial things, all that stuff was intended to point you to Christ. It's not an option now to go back and keep doing that stuff. Because once Christ has come, all that has been declared obsolete. You can't ride the fence when it comes to those sacrifices or to that priesthood. You can't have a foot in both camps. You can't have Christ as your priest over here and go back to an earthly head priest over here. If Christ is the final priest, the final sacrifice, everything now gives way to him. So, here's the author saying over and over and over, don't think that Jesus is just an option that you can put to the side when he becomes inconvenient. Because if you turn away from him, you're turning away from everything that God intended for you from the beginning, as far as the promises that he has made to us about how we become righteous, how we are set apart as holy, how we come into the right relationship. Okay, anything else you want to add from chapter 8? Okay, so let's look at chapter 9. We're going to read verses 1 to 14. Now the first covenant had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary. A tabernacle was set up in its first room with a lampstand, the table, and the consecrated bread. This was called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a room called the most holy place, which had the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered ark of the covenant. This ark contains the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. Above the ark were the cherubim of the glory overshadowing the atonement cover, but we cannot discuss these things in detail now. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry. But only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins the people had committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed, as long as the first tabernacle was still standing. This is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. They are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order. When Christ came as high priest of the good things that are already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not man-made, that is to say, not a part of his creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean, sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. Okay, now I wonder if you're already starting to get a sense that there's a lot of repetition in the book of Hebrews. Why do you think that he just keeps making this argument in every possible way over and over and over?
Because he finds so many ways to argue against him.
That's right. This argument is going to be as thorough as he can possibly make it. He's going to come at the superiority of Jesus from every possible angle, so that by the time he gets done with this letter, nobody can sit back and say, I just am not sure that Jesus is superior. It's like, there's no way to come away from this thinking there is anything superior to Jesus. And so it's partly spending a lot of time thinking through that so that it's just, percolates in your heart and your mind. Partly just the repetition, I think, is intended to emphasize whatever it is that you would look to that you think is an alternative to Jesus. It isn't. And he's going to get at everything in the Old Covenant and say none of it is a viable alternative. None of it is an option. If you've already come to Christ. Christ is the last option. You turn away from him, you're turning away from everything. Okay, now, what does the author say about the first covenant in verse 1?
Regulations.
That's right. So we talked just a minute ago about how in chapter 8, the author is comparing the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. He's pointing out how the covenant that came through Christ is superior to the covenant that came through Moses. And he's now just continuing that argument by explaining why the first covenant was inferior and insufficient, precisely because it was intended to be a shadow of something better that was coming later. So again, throughout all these verses, the author's point is really straightforward. He's saying to the readers, don't you want to worship God in a way that involves full access? Because that's what Jesus makes possible. Before Jesus came, nobody had full access. Even the high priest didn't have as full access as we have. So if you have the access through Christ that you have, why would you want to go back to anything that came before? So he starts by saying, this first covenant is defined by worship regulations and the earthly sanctuary. Okay, so what regulations and what sort of sanctuary? Well, that's what he's going to describe next. So what did the earthly sanctuary look like in verse 2?
The tabernacle.
And tell me about the first room.
The first room had a lampstand and a table and consecrated right?
Yep.
It was called the holy place.
Right. So we looked at all this in Leviticus, how the holy place, the first room represented, the tabernacle as a whole represents a heavenly throne room, like a tent of palace, where God's present in the midst of his people. And the design and the furnishings of the tabernacle were intended to reveal to people things about who God was and who they were in relation to him and how they were to approach him or not. So in that first room, the holy place, you have the lampstands, the table with the sacred bread. And we talked about in Leviticus how all those things, how the tabernacle is designed in a way to resemble the Garden of Eden. So there's a picture that you're coming back to the presence of God when you come to the tabernacle. So you have the tree and the light inside. I mean, a lampstand in the shape of a tree that symbolizes the presence of God, the light of God's face shining on his people. At the same time, it's designed like somebody's home because it the dwelling place of God. So that table that has the bread is always set as if there's a meal out, as if fellowship is always what is God's priority, that the table is always set for his people. Remember how many loaves there were? Because it represents the whole nation, so you get this picture of the light of God's face shining on the people of Israel, of this fellowship that he has called them into with himself. Okay, now all that's the first room. What's in the second room in 3 to 5?
It says that there was a curtain in between them, and that the altar of incense was in the second room. And behind it was the Ark of the Covenant with the gold jar with the manna, Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. And above the ark were the cherubim overshadowing the mercy seat.
Yes. So again, there's this allusion to the Garden of Eden, because there are cherubim that are woven into the veil that separates the holy place and the most holy place, like their garden entrance. Now, the golden altar of incense, some of you might have noticed, it says that it's in the second room, but it's actually in the first room. The incense altar was in the holy place. And it's not that the writer of Hebrews doesn't know that, but I think the reason he talks about it being in the second room is because the function of the altar of incense is more closely tied to the most holy place. So what I mean by that is, when the incense is burned on this altar, the incense altar is right there in front of the veil. And the symbolism that shows up in the Old Testament with the smoke of the incense going up is, one, the prayers of the high priest on behalf of the people going up to the Lord. Well, you know where the presence of God is. It's behind the curtain. But there's this idea of their prayers being represented by the smoke of incense. It might also be that it provides a secondary screen for the priest as he's doing his work. Because you remember when we talked about the Day of Atonement, how when the priest would even go into the most holy place, he took coals and incense with him with the smoke going up to shield him from the presence of God. So the incense altar is outside of the curtain, but in a certain sense it belongs to the most holy place. Its function is more connected to what's represented in the most holy place. So inside then, the most holy place is the most important thing in the whole tabernacle, which is the Ark of the Covenant. It's this large gold box with cherubim carved on the top, and these things that are inside it, the jar of manna, Aaron's staff, the stone tablets of the covenant, that would be the 10 Commandments. All those things are reminders of events in Israel's history that are connected with the covenant between God and his people. These are all things intended to remind the people of what happened at Sinai, what happened in the wilderness, the leadership of Aaron that God chose, as well as the stipulations of the covenant that were given in the law and the provision of God as he said them every day. And then on top of it, of course, is the mercy seat or the atonement cover, where the golden cherubim overshadow. Now, why is the ark the most important thing? Because it's the symbol of God's covenant with his people. It contains all those important reminders of their history with him, of their covenant with him. And it's also symbolic of the throne of God. It's the place where the glory of God is present in a very particular way, above the atonement cover or the mercy seat. Okay, now, there are a whole lot more things we can say about the tabernacle. You know that from Leviticus, but the author's not going to spend any more time on the details of the tent and all its furniture, because his emphasis is actually on a particular ritual that happens in the most holy place every year, and that ritual is the Day of Atonement. So let's keep going. When the tabernacle and all the furnishings had been arranged, what happened there in verses 6 and 7?
The priests would go into the holy place, regularly performing their ritual duties, and only one day the high priest would go into the most holy place and make atonement with blood for himself and the people for unintentional sin.
That's right. So the priest They were ministering every day at the tabernacle, going in and out of the holy place. They tended the lamps, they replaced the bread, they made sacrifices for the incense, did all those kinds of things. And they offered to God the gifts and sacrifices that people brought. But the focus, the intentional focus of the author is on what happened in that second room, which got used one day a year. And it was only the high priest who could go in, and only one time a year, 10th day of the 7th month, which is the Day of Atonement. On that day, he offers a sacrifice first for his sins, then for the sins of the nation. My translation says, and he went in never without blood. Do you have something similar to that? Like, just to make it very clear, he could never go past the curtain if he didn't have blood with him. Why not? That's right, and that's what keeps him out of the presence of God, right? He can't just peek around the curtain, stick his head in, right? If he doesn't have blood with him to purify himself and the people, there's no going into the presence of a holy God. So he takes a blood sacrifice for his sin and then for the sins of the nation, goes into the most holy place and sprinkles it on the atonement cover of the ark. So all of this, of course, we talked about in Leviticus, it's all symbolic of the people's sin, even their unintentional sins, that contaminate the dwelling place of God. All that's being cleansed by the blood that is sprinkled there. There's a substitutionary sacrifice necessary. Something has to die in their place. Something has to take the penalty that they deserve in order for God and the people to be at one with each other. So, this is what accomplishes atonement and covenant reconciliation is the blood of the sacrifice. So, the blood of the purification offering was sprinkled on the atonement cover. And notice how the author emphasizes right here the restrictions on the people and their access to God. They had access to the dwelling place of God, but access was very limited. One man, one time a year, never without a blood sacrifice. That's a really important part of the author's argument. Now, what was the purpose of all that, according to verse 8?
The system did not provide any direct access into God's presence for his people. Instead, it kept them away.
Yes.
It had to be another way. And that way God is a ceremonial system, only Christ can do that.
That's right. And did you notice at the beginning of verse 8, it says the Holy Spirit was showing by this. This was not a man-made system. It was God's system, and he did it the way that he did in order to demonstrate clearly, tangibly, visibly, that access to him was limited. The tabernacle was a physical illustration of a spiritual reality, which was that there was a way for people to approach God through an atoning sacrifice, but the sacrifice of an animal wasn't actually sufficient to fully open the way and to give the people freedom to draw near to a holy God. So here's God inviting people into his presence, inviting people to approach his presence, and at the same time saying, but not too close. He makes it clear he wants fellowship with them, and in order to have fellowship, there has to be atonement. But the blood of bulls and goats won't do that. There has to be a better sacrifice coming for everything in the tabernacle to happen. Okay, now, what was illustrated by the continual offering of sacrifices in verses 9 and 10?
But the gifts and the sacrifices that were being offered did not take away, and clear the conscience of the worshipers, only a matter of food and drink and
So all those gifts and sacrifices, all those daily sacrifices, as well as the annual sacrifices on the Day of Atonement, had no real effect on the sin problem of the people. And we know that because if they had, there would have been no need to keep offering them over and over and over. But they kept being offered regularly precisely because they had no power to actually change the minds and the hearts of the people or to give them a clean conscience. They couldn't actually move the people past the veil and into the most holy place. And that's the thing is you bring your sacrifice of a bull or a goat or a lamb or whatever. You offer your sacrifice and now you have atonement. That doesn't mean you can just walk into the most holy place. You still can. you still have limited access to God because all of that stuff is entirely external. When it comes to having full access to God, the problem isn't a physical barrier, it's a spiritual one. And it requires a spiritual solution. So the blood of bulls and goats is, well, it's in the same category as regulations about what you eat and drink and about ritual purification, which he mentions in verse 10. All of those things can illustrate the problem and the solution, but they're useless in bringing about any real change because they don't have any internal effect. Remember this conversation that Jesus had with the Pharisees when they got worked up about the fact that his disciples didn't wash their hands? Remember what Jesus said to them?
What goes into it, it's not what goes into a man, it's what comes out of his heart.
That's right. So God had set up this whole system of dietary laws and ritual washings. Well, some of the washings became tradition later, but some of those things he instituted. But those things were instituted in order to be an illustration for the people, not to be an end in itself. The goal of the washings and the dietary laws is to make people think about the spiritual reality they can't see, which is, how long does it take you, well, think about this in Leviticus with all the ritual laws. How easy is it to become unclean? Like you get out of bed in the morning. Okay. I mean, all the stuff that you can touch, all the different things that make you unclean. Okay, now let me ask you from a spiritual perspective. When you think about sin, how long does it take you to become unclean? The same, right? So all of those things were intended to be a physical picture of something that people are supposed to be thinking about, the spiritual consequences. To think, okay, if I become unclean that quickly in my heart and in my mind, I need a cleansing for that, but it's not blood and water that's going to accomplish that. There has to be something better. And that's what Jesus is getting at with his conversation with the Pharisees, is they're hung up on the physical washing. He's about the spiritual washing, which at the moment is not on their radar. They're just all about the external stuff, but all that external stuff is pointing to him. So here he's saying it's the internal cleanness or uncleanness that matters, and that's a matter of sin, not a matter of what you eat or drink, and also not a matter of the sacrifices, the blood, and the water that they use for cleansing.
So it's pointing to the Messiah, but they didn't hear Jesus because to them he wasn't the Messiah. So
The Holy Spirit had not awakened them.
Yeah, one of the things we're going to get to, I don't think it's next week, but the week after, is the fact that the author's going to go back and say to these readers, he's going to say basically, none of this should be a surprise to you. All this stuff about the fact that we need a new covenant and a better covenant, that we need a better priest and a better sacrifice, it should not be a surprise to you because it's actually all over the Old Testament. And he's going to point out specific places in the Old Testament where it says, you need a better priest, you need a better sacrifice, you need a better covenant. Even Jeremiah, that we looked at last week, says a new covenant has to come because the current one isn't doing the job. And so, I understand why people, had a hard time grasping Jesus was the fulfillment of all that. And yet, even when Jesus talks to Nicodemus, his attitude is, you're a teacher in Israel and you don't get this? Because it is right there in the Old Testament. But you're right, it takes the Holy Spirit to hear the words of Jesus and realize, okay, this is where all the Old Testament is pointing to all along.
Can I ask a question? Mm-hmm. So when, at the crucifixion, when the church died and blood and water comes out, is that what this is referring to then?
I'm not so sure with the water. I don't know. But it seems like the water is less about what comes. The blood is what is emphasized as coming out of him. Mm-hmm. But the water tends to be more connected to baptism.
Okay.
And to that picture in baptism of a cleansing that comes. That's only accomplished by identifying with the baptism.
Okay.
So, I don't know if that was helpful. Okay, all those regulations, those ritual regulations, they were never intended to be the end. They were always intended to be provisional. They were applied under the Old Covenant with the intent that one day they'd be replaced with something better. And what would that something better be? Well, yeah, yes, okay. So how's the ministry of Jesus better? In verses 11 and 12.
I really like this verse. But when Christ came as the high priest of the good things that we are already did,
Mm-hmm.
and he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle and not made the human thing, that is to say, not a part of his creation.
And that, there is a word but at the beginning of verse 11. Not all translations have it, but it's important. Right? He's been describing all this stuff of the Old Covenant, and then in verse 11, but. When Christ came, it was completely different. Access to God was limited under the Old Covenant, but now a new and better covenant has come through Christ. Because when he came as the ultimate and final high priest, he too entered the most holy place, but where was it? Yeah, it wasn't the tent, it wasn't the temple, it was in the heavenly places. It was in the actual heavenly presence of God. He went into heaven itself, and he didn't enter after offering a sacrifice for his own sin, because he didn't need one. And he didn't enter with the blood of goats and cattle to sprinkle on the atonement cover. Now, it just said nobody enters without blood. So how did Jesus enter? With his own. That's right. He enters offering his own blood because he is the sacrifice. No high priest ever offered himself as the sacrifice. But that's exactly what Jesus did. When he died on the cross, he accomplished in substance what all the previous sacrifices could only foreshadow. And how many times did he do it? Once. One time was all that was necessary because he was the sacrifice to end all the other sacrifices. His blood accomplished what no other blood could, because through the power of an indestructible life, he cleanses the hearts and minds of his people. So his death brings internal change, and it deals fully and finally with the problem of sin. No other sacrifice is ever necessary. Permanent atonement at 1 minute has been accomplished by Jesus, which again is why the curtain in the temple is torn in two from top to bottom when Jesus died, because now all the obstacles have been brought down. And the last thing he says in verse 12 is that by his death, Jesus delivered us out of the bondage of sin and death to an eternal redemption, where he has bought back those who are his at the cost of his own life. It's interesting he uses that language of redemption. I don't know if you remember, the last chapter of Leviticus is all about redemption. The whole chapter is about things to do with redeeming vows, redeeming people, redeeming animals, redemption. Every paragraph is about redemption. Why? Because God is a redeeming God, and redemption is already on his mind at the end of Leviticus. Not the redeeming of animals, but the redemption is going to be accomplished through Jesus. So, what was accomplished by the animal sacrifices in the first covenant? In verse 13.
Yeah, it would be clean.
Yeah. And it mentions here the blood of goats and bulls, and then also the ashes of a heifer. So that's referring to a purification ritual that's described in Numbers 19. And in Numbers 19, there had been this mass casualty event in the camp of Israel where there were dead bodies everywhere that made everything unclean. And so what the Lord told them to do was to slaughter a heifer, burn the carcass, and then take the ashes, add it to water to make a cleansing liquid for a purification ritual. So the sacrifices and the sprinkling of blood, the sprinkling of the ashes of the heifer functioned ceremonially to symbolize purification from sin and defilement and death. But again, that purification was entirely external. I had somebody ask me just a few weeks ago something about the heifer, because I don't know, something to do with the end times or something. Mm-hmm. And they said, so I hear that the Jews have they've got red heifers ready for, whatever it is that's coming. So they can slaughter the red heifers and they can, do the ceremony that happens in Numbers, but it's supposed to show up in Revelation. I remember when she said that to me, just thinking, how clean do you get from the ashes of a heifer mixed in water and sprinkled on it?
Not very.
Not very, right? Think you get ashes, right? How clean do you get with blood sprinkled on you? I mean, you actually get something on you that it's pretty hard to ever get out again, right? Imagine then coming to an understanding of who Jesus is, and then thinking, you know what, I'd like to go back to sprinkling myself with the ashes of a heifer. What is that going to get you? Wet and dirty, right? What a tragedy it is for these Jewish readers to come to the point of knowing who Christ is and to want to go back to that, to an external washing that doesn't even make you clean. Like, again, every way the author can say it, he's saying you have come to the better cleansing because you have come to the Messiah. Put that stuff to the side, because none of it was intended to be the ultimate cleansing anyway. Now you've got the final sacrifice. Take hold of him and be done with all that. To come to it and to turn away from it. And I don't think that they're intentionally thinking, you know what, Jesus is just not enough. It's just, this gospel's getting a little inconvenient. They're starting to suffer. Let's just go back to what we were doing. No, not an option. Because you turn away from him, you lose the cleansing that Christ has accomplished for you. To go back to the ashes of the heifer. No, don't go back to that. Stay with Christ. How is the sacrifice of Christ better than verse 14?
It's eternal.
Yep, eternal, never has to be offered again. How else is it better?
Internal.
It's internal, that's right, it cleanses your conscience. The sacrifice of Christ is in a whole different category. So, he wasn't a passive victim, right? I mean, how many lambs volunteered for the job? He was a willing volunteer who, through the power of the eternal Spirit of God in him, who raised him from the dead, offered himself, and he wasn't physically unblemished like the animal sacrifices. He was morally and spiritually unblemished because he was sinless. Do you remember in Leviticus the emphasis that we saw on the physical perfection of the sacrifice and the physical perfection of the priest? And here's why. Because their wholeness was a picture of holiness. Because they're foreshadowing the sinlessness of the last sacrifice who's coming. So, his sacrifice was effective in ways no other sacrifice ever was. His blood shed on the cross has the power to free us from sin and to cleanse our hearts and minds. It affects us not externally, but internally, which is where the problem has always been. And what's the result of being freed and cleansed of sin? Yep. That's the implication of this whole argument the author's making, and it's going to be worked out in more detail a little bit later. But if Christ brings down the barriers and the obstacles, if he cleanses us, if he makes it possible for us to come into the presence of God, then now we can serve him in a completely new and better way. Because the gospel has the power to take what we ought to do and turn it into what we want to do. And that makes all the difference in how we relate to God, how we serve God. Now we start to love what God loves and to hate what God hates. And that completely changes who we are as the people of God. We're not just the people of God externally. We're the people of God internally. All through the Old Testament, God kept talking about how the deliverance of his people out of Egypt was so they would be free to serve him. But what you see over and over and over is that the bondage of Egypt was not actually the problem. The bondage of sin was the problem. God could bring them out of Egypt in a snap. But getting them loose of their own idolatry, that was a different project. And that was the bondage that really mattered. The death of Jesus is what finally breaks his people out of that bondage. That's what gives us the freedom to turn away from sin and idolatry that leads to death, and instead to pursue the living. So, again, thinking about that whole argument connected with the readers. You come to Jesus, he looks good, and then you think, well, this is getting inconvenient. I'm going to go back to this other thing. What are you losing? You're losing everything that matters. He is not an optional add-on. And the writer is saying it over and over and over. So these readers know what they're losing if they put him to the side to go back to an earthly high priest, back to earthly sacrifices, back to an earthly temple. He's in a totally different category. He's what all that was pointing you to from the very beginning. So don't come to him and turn away. Take hold of him and persevere in holding him.
So do we have, is there any strong results where these people listen?
We don't know what happened with the people who received this letter. We don't know for sure.
We know that God is sovereign. Yes.
And we do know that there were Jewish believers who endured through persecution that got worse in the first century, and who were martyred because they wouldn't turn away from Christ. We know that.
And that was really,
All right, how's it relevant to us?
I think we have it pretty easy. We don't have to do all that stuff in Leviticus.
but the deeper understanding of all this is saying, let's go back to that last part in 14, so that we can serve the living God and have a deeper understanding. I guess I've never, this lesson has never, I've read a lot of Hebrews, but this is really explains a lot about the readers and about what was happening. I think studying Leviticus has helped me in a deeper way. Thank you. Sally?
Yes.
And I don't say this enough. It's been a really interesting week. And it kind of started with just what you were saying. It's like, I know God's ways are different, and I know I'll never understand them, but I kept thinking, Lord, you created this system. It didn't have to go. It's like, you knew you were going to offer this system. You knew you were going to require that every turn. And then you know, yeah, that's totally like and then there were two devotions that I was reading. I'm going to have to just read this, but I hope you guys think this is pertinent to you. In the English scripture, I'll read with the scripture verse that came to me, John 12:27-28, and this is Christ's prayer. Now my heart is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No. It was for this very reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it and will glorify it again. And then a devotional from Dad this week. This is what it said about that sacrifice there. There is all the difference in the world between sympathy for Jesus as the perfect sufferer and faith in Christ as our personal Savior. Stop and consider what he hung on the cross to do. Reflect on his spiritual suffering, the agony of bearing the judgment of his Father. Do not gaze on him so that you feel sorry for him, but until you are worshiping him. And it struck me, it just touches that. I've read this scripture before. But he said, what shall I say? Save me? And he answered, no. And it's perfect. All of the sacrifices, it just all tumbles together. And so for me, and me to devotion.
Thank you for I wanna come back to something you just said, Donna. And the reason I wanna come back to that is because I mean, everybody, when you go back to Leviticus, you think, oh, we have it so much easier. And I hear that all the time. I hear it in every Bible study, people say that all the time. Oh, I'm so glad we don't have to do this. We have it so much easier. The leaders of Hebrews actually thought Leviticus was easier. Didn't it? Why?
They didn't have to address their internal
If you're going back to the law, I mean, what's the pull of going back to? I mean, we look at all that and we're like, oh, we don't want the sacrifice, we don't want the priest, we don't want the temple. They were looking at all of that and saying, actually, we'd rather have that. That's big church.
That made them feel comfortable.
Well, seen, not unseen.
That's right. Which, by the way, we're gonna get a whole chapter about that in a few weeks. I think there's this difficulty that comes with not having the tangible things in front of you, and so knowing you have to trust God for everything. You have to trust what He's saying about you being cleansed from sin. You have to trust Him for the forgiveness that He promises. And there's something that's challenging about that when you don't have tangible, visible things in front of you. You don't have a high priest who's standing right in front of you that you talk to. You don't have a sacrifice that you cut. It's not a checklist you have that you do and you're like, okay, I'm done, I'm forgiven. You have to trust the Lord when He says it's taken care of, it's taken care of. And that's easy and it's hard, isn't it?
Sally, I remember a conversation that I had with my mom when I was young. We left the Pentecostal church way back when, and that's when I told you that Dad was so excited with the truth. He was, oh, this is a good story. But anyway, I asked Mom one time, why? Because all of our relatives were in that, and they really thought we had lost. My family was really left. And I asked my mother, well, you guys really seen things so differently from God's Word. You know, why don't they see it? Why do they stay here? Why do they go in the same type of practices? And she said, because that's the way their parents did, and their kids, and they continue, and it's comfortable, and that has always kind of stuck with me, is that if we were raised a certain way, we don't want to know anything more, because it's a comfortable family type of thing, or
There's always that temptation for everybody to
Yeah.
stay wherever it's comfortable and familiar and.
Sally, that word orientation goes back to very deep in our genes, which is the Garden of Eden. What did Adam and Eve want to do? Create their own protection, their own cover. What can we do to make sure God's not mad at us, cover up what we did? So from the very beginning of fallen man, our nature is to do something. What can I do? What can I work for to make it better? To make it acceptable? And you can see that in the sacrifice we do. I sometimes have the temptation of, oh, what can I do to make that up to you? I mean, this is the kind of first response. What can I do that confess? If this is something else I can do, if you don't feel like it's just enough time to do something more,
Yep.
so deeply ingrained.
Well, and evil is in the world, you know.
I think everybody tends to want to do penance. Yeah, to get more forgiven or feel like you know.
You just have to say, Lord, what we do.
And sometimes I think the answer is trust that you're forgiven because the sacrifice of Jesus is enough.
Well, especially if you've sinned against somebody, and the Holy Spirit brings it before them,
Yeah.
and you do want to make it right.
Yeah, and of course, if there's restitution that needs to be made, if there's things that you need to do to repair a relationship, by all means, I mean, that's godly, it's calls us to do that. But I remember when I started studying Leviticus, I remember just looking up the word atonement in the dictionary. And it's amazing how the dictionary definition is completely different now from the Bible, the biblical definition, because the dictionary definition is that you do something to make up for something wrong that you did. And don't you notice that in the way the culture uses the word atonement? If you're going to atone for yourself, isn't the implication that you have to somehow go back and make up for the bad stuff that you did? And yet the biblical idea of atonement is you can't possibly make up for what you did. But God has gifted you atonement. And that atonement is symbolized in the sacrifice. It's symbolized in something dying in your place. But it's always easier to say, well, I can make atonement for myself if you just give me the checklist and tell me what to do. But that doesn't take any faith.
One of the reasons culture will draw people in, cults draw you in on my work, and work the rest, do something.
It's nice to feel like you're in control. Well, you're not really, but you have the illusion of control. All right. Any last comments? Anything you want to add?